Ethan Caldwell had never thought of himself as the kind of guy who would end up in a neighborhood war, not in real life. Not in a quiet place like Willow Ridge where mornings smell like cut grass and everyone pretends they like each other at the mailbox. I'm a licensed land surveyor, 26 years in the field. I deal with property lines, old deeds, boundary disputes that usually get solved with a clipboard and a handshake. Not this. Not whatever this turned into. It started in a way that almost felt stupid at first, like something you'd complain about once and then forget. My driveway getting blocked. That's it. Nothing dramatic. Just inconvenience. Except it kept happening, again and again, until inconvenience stopped being the right word. The first time I almost laughed it off. A couple cars parked a little too far, garden club meeting next door. I stood there waiting like, okay, fine. People are social, whatever, but then it happened again the next week, and then a pool party, and then delivery trucks for her renovations just sitting there like my driveway was part of their parking plan. And every time I would come out, same story. Same calm voice from across the fence like it was nothing. Melissa Grant lived behind me. HOA president, the kind of person who always looks like she has already decided she's right before you even speak. Perfect house. Manicured everything. The kind of order that feels controlled more than peaceful. And every time I mentioned the blocking, she would just smile like I was being dramatic. It's temporary, Ethan. Don't make it a thing. Or, you'll survive a little inconvenience. Like I was the problem for needing access to my own property. 8 times in 4 months. 8 separate moments where I stood in my driveway watching my own life get paused by someone else's routine. And the worst part wasn't even the blocking. It was how normal she made it sound. Like I was the unreasonable one for expecting a driveway to function as a driveway. I remember one morning specifically. I was already late for a site inspection, coffee gone cold in my hand, truck loaded with equipment. And there's a black SUV sitting right across the entrance like it belongs there, engine off. Nobody, even inside. Just there. And I stood there for a long moment thinking this is what it feels like when nobody takes you seriously in your own space. I didn't explode. That's not really my nature. I document, I observe, I measure. That's what I've always done, so I started doing that here too. Not emotionally, just mentally logging it. Time, date, type of blockage, cause, duration, and every entry started to look less like random inconvenience and more like a pattern I didn't like the shape of. And the thing about patterns is once you see them, you can't unsee them. They start following you around, even when the problem isn't physically there anymore. And I started noticing how often her social life collided with my only exit point. How often temporary lasted long enough to ruin my schedule. How often my complaints were turned back on me like I was the antisocial one for wanting my driveway to function like a driveway. One evening I came back from a long boundary job out near the county line, exhausted, sunburned, just wanting quiet. And there it was again, cars stacked in front of my exit, music drifting over the fence, laughter like nothing else in the world mattered, and I just stood there longer than I should have, not angry yet, just aware, deeply aware, that this wasn't going to fix itself, because nobody who was doing it thought it was wrong. That night I didn't sleep much, not because I was mad, but because my brain wouldn't let go of the idea that I was dealing with something I couldn't solve with words, and I started thinking like I do when I'm working a hard survey job. What do I actually know? What is fact? What is assumption? What can be measured? And I realized something uncomfortable. I knew my property better than anyone else in that neighborhood. I literally had the tools, the license, the authority to verify reality on paper, and yet I had been treating this like a social problem instead of a physical one. The next morning I stopped arguing, stopped complaining to the HOA office, stopped trying to be reasonable with people who were already ignoring reason, and I pulled out my equipment, GPS unit, old plats, county records I had kept over the years just as reference, and I walked my land slowly like I was back on a job site, not my home, not my personal frustration. Just work, lines, markers, geometry, truth in physical space. At first it looked normal, everything where it should be, fence lines familiar, corners I had checked before, but the deeper I went into the verification, the more something subtle started to bother me. Not a loud mistake, not an obvious error, just a quiet inconsistency between what the official record said and what the physical world was actually doing, like a map that almost fits reality, but not quite. And in my line of work, almost is never acceptable, because almost is where legal problems are born. I told myself it was probably old survey drift, outdated benchmarks. Maybe something from the original subdivision. Nothing unusual on its own, but I kept checking anyway, because once that part of your brain switches on, the one that doesn't accept uncertainty, you don't really get to turn it off again until you've answered it properly. And that was the first moment I felt like this wasn't going to stay a driveway problem, not even close, because something in the ground level story of this neighborhood didn't match the version everyone had been living in, and I was about to find out exactly how wrong it was. I didn't sleep much after that, because once you see a crack in something you thought was solid, your brain just keeps going back to it over and over like it refuses to let you ignore it. And I kept thinking about those property lines, those tiny inconsistencies I had brushed off as old survey errors, until finally I went back out there with my full equipment, not just a casual walk anymore. I set up the GPS unit properly, pulled county records, original plats, everything I could legally access as a licensed surveyor, and I started running it like a real job, not a personal curiosity. And that's when the picture started to form in a way that honestly made me feel a little sick. Because the math didn't just drift slightly, it consistently pulled in one direction, toward her house, toward Melissa Grant's property behind mine. And I remember standing there in the yard with the receiver beeping steadily, thinking there is no way this is real, no way something like this just sits here for decades unnoticed in a neighborhood like this. But the data doesn't care what you believe, it just shows you what is there. Over the next few days, I expanded the survey. I cross-checked with older county archives, scanned microfiche records, even called in a colleague under the excuse of a boundary review for a hypothetical case, because I didn't want anyone connecting it back to Willow Ridge yet, and every layer I peeled back made it worse, not better, until I finally traced the original subdivision map from the late 90s. The year her house was built, and that's when I saw it, a misaligned benchmark in the original construction survey, a critical reference point that shifted everything just enough to push her entire structure slightly onto my land, not by inches, but by feet, and not just a fence or a corner, but the garage, part of the deck, and a section of the foundation itself. I remember just sitting in my truck for a long time after that, engine off, staring at nothing. Because as a surveyor you understand what that means. It means every assumption people have about ownership, about boundaries, about what is yours and what isn't, suddenly becomes negotiable in a way nobody wants to think about. I didn't rush it though. I double-checked everything again and again, because if I was wrong this would destroy more than just a neighborhood reputation, it would destroy my credibility. But the result never changed. Melissa Grant's house was partially built on my land, approximately 1,800 square feet of it, and she had been living there for over 20 years under what looked like complete normality. That's when I finally brought it to the county, not as a complaint, but as a formal corrected survey filing, clean, documented, stamped with my license number, and I expected resistance honestly. Bureaucracy usually pushes back on things like this, but instead the county records office confirmed it after their own review. And I still remember the clerk looking at me with that slow blink of realization like she had just understood a long-forgotten mistake. Within a week things stopped being quiet. I didn't tell Melissa directly at first. I sent a formal notice through legal channels, an invitation to resolve the encroachment within 90 days, remove structures, or enter settlement discussions, and that was when the neighborhood shifted, because word spreads fast in places like Willow Ridge, especially when it involves HOA leadership, and suddenly I wasn't just the guy with the blocked driveway anymore. I was the guy who had challenged the president of the HOA itself. The first confrontation happened on a Saturday morning. I was outside checking the property markers again when she walked over, perfectly dressed like she always was, sunglasses, coffee in hand, like she was heading into a casual meeting instead of a crisis, and she didn't even try to hide the annoyance in her voice when she said, "Ethan, I heard you're making some ridiculous claim about my house." And I remember I just looked at her for a second before answering. Not emotional, just steady, I said. "It's not a claim. It's a survey. Your structure crosses my boundary line by about 12 feet. And she laughed, actually laughed, like I had told a joke that wasn't funny enough to matter. And she said, "You people always think you can dig up something on paper and rewrite real life. But I've been here 26 years. This is my home." And I told her quietly, "That doesn't change the numbers." That was the first time I saw something in her expression shift, just slightly, not fear yet, but irritation turning into something sharper. The HOA got involved almost immediately after that. Of course they did. and suddenly I was getting emails from board members I had never spoken to before, suggesting mediation, suggesting misunderstandings, suggesting anything that would make this go away quietly. But I had already filed everything officially, so there was no quiet version left. Then came her lawsuit. She claimed adverse possession, arguing that because she had occupied the space for over 2 decades, it was legally hers. And I remember reading the filing in my kitchen that night with a strange sense of disbelief. Because in theory, she wasn't wrong to try it. But in practice, it requires good faith occupation, and I knew her history with me and others in that neighborhood didn't exactly support that narrative. The courtroom hearing was not dramatic in the way people expect from movies. It was slower, colder, more procedural, but the tension was still there, especially when I took the stand and explained the methodology of the survey, the GPS data, the historical records, the consistency across multiple verification points. And when her attorney tried to paint it as a technical dispute, the judge stopped him mid-sentence and said the question here is not confusion. It is legitimacy of occupation. I will never forget that moment, because the entire room went quiet, and for the first time I saw Melissa not as the HOA president, not as the confident neighbor who blocked my driveway 8 times and dismissed me like I was nothing, but as someone realizing the ground she had built her life on was not legally hers in the way she believed. The judge ultimately denied her claim, stating clearly that adverse possession cannot be supported when the occupation is not in good faith, especially in the context of ongoing conflict and documented disputes. And just like that, the legal foundation she was standing on collapsed. After that hearing, everything accelerated. I issued the formal enforcement notice. 90 days became the countdown everyone in the neighborhood started whispering about, and I didn't even need to say much anymore, because the survey spoke for itself, the county records spoke for themselves, and the reality was now unavoidable. By the time everything reached its final point, Willow Ridge didn't feel like a neighborhood anymore. It felt like a place holding its breath, like even the wind was waiting to see what would break first, and I won't pretend I didn't feel it too, because once you set something like this in motion, even when you're legally right, even when every document backs you up, there's still that strange weight in your chest that reminds you this isn't just paperwork anymore. This is people's lives, shifting in real time. The 90-day deadline had been on everyone's mind for weeks, whispered about at mailboxes, at driveways, in little conversations that stopped the moment I walked closer, and I stopped pretending not to hear it. I just kept working the same way I always do, methodical, calm, following what the data says instead of what the emotion wants. On the morning of enforcement, I didn't wake up feeling powerful. I woke up feeling focused, like I was heading to a job site that just happened to involve my own property and a whole lot of history nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud. Contractors arrived early, not aggressive, not dramatic, just practical, marking the verified boundary line with stakes and string that looked almost too simple for what they represented. I remember standing there watching them work and thinking how strange it is that something so life-changing can be reduced to a few points in the ground and a straight line between them. Melissa came out when the first posts went in. She didn't look like the same person who used to smile through every complaint. There was no confidence left in it, just disbelief trying to hold itself together, and she said my name like it still meant something could be negotiated, like this was still a conversation instead of an outcome. "Ethan, you can't actually be doing this," she said, and I remember answering without raising my voice, not angry, not proud, just factual. "I already did. This is just the part where it becomes real." And that's when it hit her, not all at once, but in pieces, because reality doesn't usually collapse in a single moment. It breaks in stages. The fence line went up slowly, section by section, and every new post made the situation more undeniable. Because it wasn't theoretical anymore. It was physical, it was visible, it was final in a way arguments can't undo. And then it happened exactly as the survey predicted. The line cut directly through what she had always treated as her own space, straight through the driveway access she had used for years without question, and across the edge of her deck, dividing it into 2 halves that no longer worked together. And I won't lie, watching that moment wasn't satisfying in the way people imagine. It was quieter than that, heavier, like watching gravity do its job. Neighbors started appearing without announcing themselves, standing at windows, on porches, pretending they weren't watching but absolutely watching. because nobody expects a clean legal line to suddenly become a physical interruption in someone's life like that. Within days, the ripple effects started, not dramatic explosions, just steady consequences, the kind that build quietly and then suddenly become impossible to ignore. Her attempts to quietly sell the property stalled because no buyer wants an active boundary dispute sitting in the middle of a title report. And then the bank got involved, because banks don't care about emotions, they care about risk. And suddenly what had been a home was now a liability sitting on contested ground. I still remember one evening hearing her voice outside near the fence, not loud, not commanding like before, just tired, and she said, "You didn't have to take it this far." And I almost laughed, because from my side it felt like I had done the least I possibly could have done while still following every rule. I told her, I didn't take it anywhere, I documented it, I filed it, I gave notice, I waited, everything after that is just consequence. That silence between us after that was different, not angry anymore, just empty in a way that means something has already ended even if nobody has physically left yet. The settlement that followed wasn't cinematic. There were no dramatic speeches, just documents, numbers, signatures that felt too small for how much weight they carried. But the result was final. She paid what was required. The property was sold at a loss. And within a short time, she was gone from Willow Ridge completely, like she had been erased from a place she once controlled. I removed part of the fencing later, not out of spite, but because the line had done its job. It had corrected what was never aligned in the first place, and standing there afterward, looking at the reclaimed space, I didn't feel like I had won anything. I just felt like something that had been wrong for a long time had finally stopped being ignored. The HOA board changed quietly after that, almost embarrassed by the attention it brought, and one of the first new rules they passed was simple but telling, that future HOA presidents cannot live in direct adjacency to properties they oversee, which says more about everything that happened than any argument ever could. And even now, when I drive through Willow Ridge, it doesn't feel like victory or revenge. It just feels like a reminder that most conflicts don't start big. They start small, ignored, repeated, normalized, until one day someone finally decides to measure what everyone else assumed didn't need measuring.